आजको चाहिँ mainly I have a little small presentation, walkthrough, and then sort of like a demo of Swagger with Next.JS. Um, so today what we will cover is we will cover what Swagger is, what Swagger and Swagger UI is, what is the benefit of using Swagger UI in Next.js. We'll have a step-by-step integration of Swagger UI, and there will be a little demo, and then we'll also go over just some basic best practice for maintaining the API documentation. um, सो ओभरअलमा भन्नुपर्दाखेरि स्वागर भनेको एउटा ओपन सोर्स टुल हो. इट इज अ टुल बिल्ड एराउन्ड ओपन एपिआई भन्ने एउटा फ्रेमवर्क हुन्छ. एन्ड इट इज एसेन्सियली युज्ड टु डकुमेन्ट रेस्टफुल एपिआइज. RESTful APIs भनेको even the ones that we created for our backend in Bazaar for Me, or anything you create, backend API you create using Spring Boot or even Next.js, those are all RESTful APIs. And that's essentially Swagger UI चाहिँ it acts like an agent. कस्तो भने whenever you're coding a backend, until and unless you take that URL of that endpoint and plug it into the front end, that's one way of testing if the endpoint is working. But what if you're not working on the front end, you're just working on the back end only explicitly? Then you need to have a way of testing it. अस्ति हामीले कुरो गर्दाखेरि पोस्टम्यान भयो, सोप युआई भयो, these are some of the tools that can directly hit the endpoint, and we can test out if it's returning everything correctly. But another way would be Swagger UI, where you just plug couple of dependencies in your project, and then you specify what each endpoint is doing, and then you're able to test it right then and there. And I'll show you guys an example. I have at least 2 examples that I've already created. So essentially that's what Swagger UI is. Use cases चाहिँ मैले अघि भने जस्तै इन्टरेक्टिभ एपिआई एक्सप्लोरेसन. सो हाम्रो होल ब्याकएन्डमा के छ त हाम्रो एभाइलेबल एपिआई हो, त्यसलाई एक्सप्लोर गर्न पाइयो, टेस्टिङ गर्न पाइयो. सो वी क्यान डिरेक्टली गो टु स्पेसिफिक एन्ड पोइन्ट एन्ड वी क्यान टेस्ट इट. अनि वी क्यान अल्सो सेयर एपिआई डकुमेन्टेसन विथ टिम्स एन्ड क्लाइन्ट्स. सो अब let's say you worked on an endpoint, and instead of telling your friend, your colleague, instead of telling them to go and look at the code, you can just tell them to go to look at the Swagger UI, because it has all the details. It has like what the header would be, what the endpoint URL is, what the response would be, what the request body might be, if it's a post request or get request, all of those things. So those are some of the use cases. Benefit of using a Swagger UI. So like I mentioned earlier, simplification, API testing and debugging को लागि चाहिँ एकदमै राम्रो हुन्छ. सो अब मैले अघि भनेको एक्जाम्पलमा, let's say if you had a backend and some API, and if you go to the front end and start to use the API without testing it, then there might be so many bugs that happen on the backend side that the front end won't show you. Tara, if you implement Swagger UI, then you can just explicitly test your endpoint in the backend, try to break it, try to validate that the right response is coming back. त्यसो गरे पछाडि डिबगिङ र टेस्टिङको लागि एकदमै एफिसिएन्ट भयो. Seamless integration with modern React based framework. So OpenAPI ले बनाएको Swagger को जुन implementation छ त्यो पनि it really works well with Next.js अनि React libraries like Express. Express is explicitly for backend, for creating APIs. And another benefit is a centralized API documentation. So मैले अघि भने नि, कसैले फ्युचरमा एउटा नयाँ डेभलपर आयो अरे आफ्नो कम्पनीमा अथवा आफ्नो टिममा, having them go through all the different routers and all the different code to figure out what endpoints we have, what functionality we are allowing during a certain phase. It's very tough when you just have to give them the code base and tell them to go look for that, right? But at a centralized location ma, if Swagger UI is implemented, then you can just give tell them to run the app, go to whatever localhost slash Swagger or something, and then they'll be able to look at everything in one centralized location. So that is also one benefit. So अब step by step चाहिँ we can kind of dive into that. Before I do, Tigaram, do you have anything to add in terms of what I've just laid out? If you're here,
He's on mute.
is he on mute? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think you summed it up perfectly. But one thing I wanted to add was um, something you touched on. But let's say you're working on the back end, you're the back end engineer, and you might be using Java um, for the back end. Like your company uses Java for the back end, and then front end happens with JavaScript. So whenever the team or anyone on the front end wants to know about like what endpoints are there in the back end and what's actually happening in the back end, they won't be able to do it because they're JavaScript engineers. I mean, as an engineer, you might know Java, JavaScript, everything, but that is not expected. So Swagger would allow you to not look into the language, code, or anything like that. There's you can just look at Swagger UI, the docs, and then you can figure out okay what actually exists in the back end, and then go from there.
Yeah,
And there are also tools out there, like for example, if backend has Swagger properly implemented, then there are tools out there that like terminal tools that can automatically generate code that will call those endpoints. So let's say if you're working on a JavaScript project, then it will automatically generate all the fetch requests that you need to make, and it will just become a library that you can just use without having you to type out all the URLs, the data types, and everything. You'll just implement it for you. That's also another benefit of it.
yeah.
But yeah, other than that, I think you covered it all.
Okay. Yeah, and then in terms of step by step, अब हाम्रो अहिलेको प्रोजेक्टमा चाहिँ I've already gone ahead and done a couple of these things, but for the purpose of the video, there are a couple of steps that you need to do. First up, if you're using, we're using Yarn for package management, but if you're using npm, this works as well. You need to add some of these packages like the Swagger UI React, Swagger UI Express, and then YML JS. Once you add those packages, you also need well, if you're working with TypeScripts and not just vanilla JavaScript, then it's also beneficial to add the type slash node. But this is something that most people do at the beginning of the project. As soon as you decide that you're going to be doing TypeScript and not vanilla, this is probably a step that you can skip because you probably done it, you know, as soon as you started the project when you start using .ts instead of .js. Um, and then you need to add some code to the app slash API folder, and then you have to add swagger.yaml file. That's where the specifications will go in your root, and then that's all you need to do. So like let me just basically go from the top. So this is our project right here, right? So um I think if I oh wait, no, let me just do something else. All right, I'm gonna run the project real quick, but if I go to packet.json, then some of the packages that I was talking about earlier, the Swagger UI Express, Swagger UI React, and then Express. Also, I brought in a new. There. I don't think I need these ones because we're not using TypeScript, but I'll clean this up later. But mainly TypeScript use गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ you always need to have the at type Swagger UI Express. So यो डकुमेन्टेसनमा भएको चाहिँ if you're just using vanilla JavaScript, then you can use this yarn command to add the packages. But
Just still on. sharing your screen. I think just
Did it freeze or did it just
no,
quit?
it ended. And it, somehow it.
Oh, okay, I see. How about now? Are we good now?
That's good.
Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, you need to have the at type at the beginning. But I know in the slide it mentioned to it didn't really show that here, but that is if you're just using vanilla JavaScript. But here we're using TS, so you need to have the at TS slash the package name. So once you get the package, let me just go to the API. So in API dot API app slash API, I have this folder called Swagger, and I have the routes there. And these routes are just like the routes that we created for any other endpoint, right? We have the basic CRUD functions here for post. We have the CRUD function for put and delete, and then I believe we have one for get somewhere. Oh yeah, right here. So forget. So this is just vanilla code. All it does is it just when Swagger UI triggers and tries to call an endpoint, it goes through this route and then eventually returns back a response from our backend API. And obviously, for all of this to work, you need to have your database running, and you need to have some data in your database. But that's the route file, and then this is just a component in the front end. So if you look inside the app, I created another folder called Swagger. So when you go to localhost 3000 slash Swagger, then this page loads, and this is just a front end component where where we will be able to see like all the Swagger documentation. And this is already done for us for the purpose of going forward with Swagger in our project. It's already implemented, but if you were to add this in a completely new project, then these are the two places that are really important for you to like actually have a working Swagger. And the last but एकदमै इम्पोर्टेन्ट कुरा चाहिँ यो स्वागर डट यामल भन्ने फाइल हुन्छ होइन, त्यो चाहिँ रुट लेभलमै राखेको हुन्छ. What that does is it has all the specifications about a certain API or endpoint. So let's just go through what this means. अब यो माथिको चाहिँ it's just basic metadata type information, just the version of Open API, a little bit of title and description, and then the version of this file itself. But everything under path is pretty much an endpoint, right? So we have an endpoint called API slash auth, API slash auth, and inside there we have a route.ts. So pretty much this endpoint is trying to document this actual endpoint. And then this indicates that it's a post method. If it was a get method, we'll use get. If it was a put method, then we'll use put. Delete, and same thing for delete. This tag essentially gives that I guess this endpoint a name. Um, and then the summary acts as, I mean, there's limited information in here right now, but it's good to have these always, although they don't have any like actual functions. um that's part of the documentation, right? You want to be able to explain as much as possible in these tags and summaries, so that way when a developer comes in, new developer comes in, or another person is trying to test, then they know exactly what they're testing. And then here we have the request body. Sometimes not all endpoints will have request bodies. Usually post methods do, and put method also. So after that annotation, you can have request body required. You require true garo भने चाहिँ even in the Swagger UI it won't let you call until you actually provide the request body. And then the content, what type of response are you looking for, the schema. Schema चाहिँ अब यो चाहिँ it's actually you are defining what the body is gonna look like, because we're inside the body now at this point. So you defined, okay, this endpoint is gonna require a request body of type object, and the objects are gonna be email and password. And even that could be specified more. For example, email is of type string, and format is email, and then you can also add a description. So that is a part that is literally defining what the request body would look like, and then what the response will look like. You can have it down here like this. So the response it's not always going to be 200, right? So sometimes when you hit an endpoint, it might be 401, it might be 400, it might be 500. Right now I only have 3 laid out here. If the response comes back with a happy face, then what do we want to show? We want the data to reflect that, right? So you, instead of having it done the way I have it here, where I've actually defined all the schema within the request body, in the response, what I'm doing is I'm actually using a reference um, to this user response, and that user response is actually defined down here. Um, so this pretty much is, and then that user response is referring to this user um, definition, and I think that one comes from our actual type that we defined somewhere here. Um, So that is how we would map the response. And then if it's 400, and like if it's 401, then we'll say on unauthorized invalid credentials. If it's 400, then it's bad request. 400 bad request usually happens when maybe you have the header wrong, or maybe you have the request body wrong, or you didn't provide any request body although it was required, things like that. So that's how you would document pretty much one endpoint. And I know this looks long, um, but once you get used to creating one or two, then it's pretty straightforward. And I did the same thing for API slash program. It's literally the same thing. I mean, at least, but for this one, there is no request body, there is no header. But we do have parameters. So we have, like, in this API slash program, for getting a single program or multiple programs, we have like the parameter, role parameter. We have active or inactive parameter, and then we also have the is it free or not parameter. So that's how you would define a parameter. अब यहाँ माथि अघि रिक्वेस्ट बडी डिफाइन गरेको थियो, यसमा रिक्वेस्ट बडी मात्रै छ, parametersहरू पास गरेको छैन. यसमा parameters छ. You would just annotate it with parameters, and then you will define what parameters are needed, and whether if they're required or not. You can also define that. And then response, same thing as the one for auth. You pretty much provide what the response type is going to look like, and then yeah, you have these other error states also. But यसमा चाहिँ 500 200 मात्रै रहेछ, but we definitely have to add more to it. 401 र 400 पनि definitely गर्दा राम्रो हुन्छ. Now that's the code. Let's just go to localhost and see what I've been talking about. So if you go to localhost slash swagger, then you'll see मैले अघि माथि भनेको metadata shows up here, and that tag is this right here, and then the definition of the tag, and then for program, same thing. And if you extend this, then inside there we have a get endpoint that I have defined, the get slash API slash programs. And then if you expand that, then we have this really nice UI that shows us Okay, to hit this endpoint, we need to have role active and free parameters. Um, if it's a 200, then this is what the response is gonna look like. If it's 500, this is what it's gonna look like. It defines all of that for us, right? And it's so nice to, like, test it this way, because you know exactly what you need. You know exactly what endpoint it is, you know exactly like what the descriptions of it all is and what it's doing. So it's really neat. And if you just hit try it out, and let's say you have your database running as well, and there is an example here. So I know we have in my local database, I know I have some children programs, right? So let me just do true true and execute. Then if it finds the data and comes back successfully, then it should look like this, right? So yeah, it found the alphabet um, program for children, and that's the only program I think we have right now in terms of what is saved in the database, because I think the other two, the YouTube one and the game one, they don't have any data sets in our database, but the alphabet does. So it found that and it gives you that back. Essentially, this is what we're trying to get to, right? This is where we're trying to get to in terms of every endpoint. So we have like the programs endpoint. Even within the programs endpoint, I only worked on the get, but we have a put, we have a post, we have a delete. Same thing with the email, contact email that we um, have the form. I think we saved that data in our database as well. So we're gonna have get, put, delete definitions to work on with that one as well. So essentially, this is what it is. Tigaram, fill in if I missed anything, and then I can again come back to the last bits.
Yeah, I think you're good.
Okay, so that is that. Let me see if go to my slides. So some of the best practices, keep your open API specifications up to date. So obviously, as soon as we work on the Swagger API documentation, um, in the future we might modify the service, right? Like one of the endpoints might change. Maybe the request body will change, or maybe the parameters will change. So it's really important to update the Swagger UI specifications along with the changing of your endpoint, because I mean, if you have two different things, then everything can get messy. You're testing with the old information, but the new endpoint is kind of looking for something else. So it's really important to keep that updated. Versioning your Swagger documentation for backend capabilities. um I guess that actually happens automatically. No, not necessarily, but once we get a version, it's rarely that we update to a new version, unless we necessarily, I mean, we have to, um, unless it's like super cool to, like, just move on to something that's completely new. Usually, once, I mean, in my experience, once a version of Swagger is implemented, um, I guess, moving from that version to another might break stuff. So usually we just stick with the latest one when we implement it, and then we go from there. um and then using tools like Swagger Hub or Postman for collaboration. So like I was mentioning earlier, uh, this Swagger implementation kind of attaches to your project, and as you're running your project, you can actually go to /Swagger, kind of test your APIs from there. But something like Postman, you can use to test as well. It's a little different though, because it's not gonna have that nice UI, but it's still a tool that you can use. Where you can have your local host running. I'm trying to see if this will load, but you will have to provide all the different parameters and request body and um, like all these headers, whatever is required. Postman mazi, you'll have to provide all of that yourself. But Swagger you, mazi, since you already documented it, when you're going to test it, everything is there already. You just need to provide the data. But postmanहरूबाट चाहिँ you're gonna have to know the key value pair हुन्छ नि अब what is the name of the header that you want, you need to provide that. It's a little bit it's a bit more work than Swagger, but it's really a great tool to use, especially when testing. And Swagger sorry, Postman को चाहिँ we will definitely do a whole different learning session altogether. um, but this time we're just doing Swagger. But Postman is also something that we use for testing APIs and things like that.
Something to add with that. So Postman is like completely decoupled from your project, unlike
Yeah,
Swagger, because Swagger goes into the code. So like whenever you make a change or something, you have to commit it within your code base. So it's literally just together with your project. But Postman, you can have something separately, your personal own playground where you add different endpoints and everything. And like that, there are companies who have their entire documentation in Postman as well. But uh, once the company grows, it becomes a hassle because you have to share the same workplace with multiple companies and actually connect to the project itself. So it's two-edged sword, I guess, because uh, one provides convenience, the other just is within the project, and it could scale very well.
yeah. So with that being said, I think हाम्रो learning session for Swagger specifically has come to an end.
Is not in one place like you showed like in the YAML file. You can annotate different what is it called, different controller functions specifically. So let me quickly share my screen. uh, can you see my VS code?
Yep.
Yeah, so for example, this is a file where it contains our endpoints for or a router for the products that we might return. And we can, since this is doing something specifically for getting all the products, we are defining the documentation literally just above it. Same thing for getting like different kind of products, getting new product, or there's so many other endpoints, and we documented within. Uh, so there's locality, so like it's close by to what um, is actually documenting, and we have a whole um, I don't know, command line or script that actually gathers all of these things and puts it into a YAML file whenever we build this project. So at the end of the day, whatever Ganesham showed is the end result, but um, this actually documents it in places where it's actually like if it like documented something that's specific to that thing that it's documenting basically. So it's not just in one place that you have to define. You can just define what it actually needs to be defined, and it'll the script will just catch all of this and put it into a one big YAML file, and that's what Swagger will use and show the what is it called, the UI basically. So in here we have a bunch of things here. So like for the product one, if I go here, so like it'll show and we have different things. But at the end of the end result is the same, but there are many different ways of doing this. And even better than like both of the examples that we showed is in Java. In Java, you don't even need to write or in a Spring Boot, like the framework in Java, you don't even need to write OpenAI specification yourself. like the library or the dependency will automatically pick it up based on the parameters and the response values, because Java is a type of language, so it will automatically pick everything up, and document it for you. You don't have to actually do anything.